The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded with military precision, taped right onto my brand new blue mailbox. In bold red letters, it read, Violation Code 4.7, Unauthorized Color Scheme. 48 hours to repaint. 48 hours. 2 days to erase the one thing that made my corner house stand out in a sea of beige. At first, I thought it was some sort of prank. Willow Creek wasn't exactly a utopia, but I'd lived here for 6 years without issue. Sure, we had our share of HOA nonsense, trash bin placement, lawn height inspections, and the occasional gossip-fueled decorative wreath scandal, but a mailbox color ban? That was new even for them. Then it hit me. This wasn't about paint. This was about control. And I wasn't about to roll over. Willow Creek was one of those communities that looked perfect from the outside. Neatly trimmed hedges, synchronized sprinklers misting at dawn, identical mailboxes lined like obedient soldiers. The HOA loved to brag about visual consistency and community pride. Behind the curtain, though, it was a different story. Power-hungry board members treated the association like their personal kingdom. Rules were rewritten, fines were issued, and every decision came with a thin layer of pettiness. At the top sat Linda M., the HOA president. A retired interior designer with a talent for making small problems massive. Residents jokingly called her palette police. Her obsession with color harmony bordered on fanaticism. There was once a meeting where she debated whether a neighbor's front door shade leaned too cool-toned for the street's warm palette. Linda had been waiting for me to slip. See, I'd been vocal at meetings, challenging fees, questioning unnecessary restrictions, and occasionally, often, mocking their overreach. She'd tolerated me until now. But this? The blue mailbox? That was my rebellion in full view of the entire cul-de-sac. And apparently, that was enough. 2 days. That's what the violation letter said. 48 hours to repaint my mailbox, in compliance with approved neutral tones per CCR Section 4.3. I found the exact document in my old HOA binder. I'd kept every rule update since I moved in, partly for reference, partly for ammunition. CCR Section 4.3 clearly listed approved finishes: antique bronze, slate gray, and classic black. No mention of blue. But here's the kicker, there was also a clause stating any modification, consistent with the aesthetic of the neighborhood and not in disrepair, could be reviewed upon request. I'd filed that request weeks earlier. The board never responded. So technically, my blue mailbox was under pending review. The association just decided to skip due process entirely. And if I didn't comply before Friday's inspection, they'd start daily fines at $150 per day, plus administrative review costs. It was petty HOA revenge at its finest. But they underestimated one thing: I had time, paint, and a very active imagination. The next morning, I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, even copies of the original design review form I'd submitted. I stapled the violation notice to it like a badge of honor. Neighbors noticed. People stopped mid-jog to ask what was going on. I told them the truth, that the HOA was cracking down on creativity. The word spread faster than the morning sprinklers. By noon, a small crowd had gathered near my driveway. Some laughed, others shook their heads. But one thing became clear: everyone had their own story of getting burned by the HOA. The older couple down the street had been fined for leaving a holiday wreath up until January 3rd. Another neighbor, Tom, got cited for using an unapproved shade of mulch. These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a power structure spiraling into absurdity. That evening, I saw Linda pacing in front of my property with her clipboard, jotting notes like a detective at a crime scene. I didn't approach her. I just watched from behind my living room blinds as she glared at the blue mailbox under the setting sun. That's when I decided, if they wanted me to repaint it, I'd repaint it. But on my terms. Before I even opened a paint can, I did my research. I found every clause, every loophole, every line in the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that could possibly work in my favor. The HOA wanted harmony. I'd give them harmony, just not the kind they expected. First, I submitted another mailbox color resubmission form citing Section 4.7(b) reconsideration permitted upon artistic intent or community significance. They'd buried that line deep in the fine print, assuming no one would notice. Then, I printed a color sample sheet titled Shades of Blue in American History. From Revolutionary Navy to Presidential Sky. I attached it as Exhibit A. The stage was set. Friday's inspection was supposed to be a quiet check-in. But I had no intention of letting that happen quietly. As I prepped my tools, a plan began to form, part protest, part performance, part HOA nightmare. Friday morning arrived like a countdown clock. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind of sticky calm that settles in before a thunderstorm. By 8 a.m., I had everything ready, paint cans lined in a perfect semicircle, each labeled with a different, approved neutral tone. Beneath them, my bright blue mailbox stood proudly, untouched and defiant. The HOA inspection team, Linda and her sidekick, the treasurer, walked up the driveway with matching clipboards. They didn't greet me. They just started snapping pictures, measuring, whispering like stage critics judging a play. I asked whether they'd reviewed my resubmission form. They pretended not to hear. The treasurer muttered something about non-compliance escalation. So I let them finish their little show. Then, as they were leaving, I rolled out a whiteboard with one phrase written across it in thick black marker, pending review, CCR Section 4.7(b). They froze. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I just stood beside the blue mailbox, arms crossed, waiting for them to process the fact that I'd used their own rulebook as a shield. That evening, the violation fine increased. The email subject line read, Notice of continuing non-compliance, immediate action required. Fines would begin at midnight, $150 per day, plus a potential lien if not resolved within 10 days. I laughed out loud. They were doubling down, hoping intimidation would make me fold. But they didn't realize something, this wasn't just about me anymore. By now, the entire neighborhood was talking. People stopped during their evening walks just to see what I'd do next. A few neighbors even brought snacks, sitting on their lawns like it was neighborhood theater. One woman whispered that Linda had scheduled a special board meeting for Monday night to address ongoing nonconformities. That phrase alone, nonconformities, told me exactly what kind of show she planned to run. I had 72 hours before that meeting. 72 hours to turn their petty power trip into a public reckoning. And I knew exactly how to do it. I spent the weekend preparing my next move. First, I pulled out HOA Annual Budget 2024.pdf from the member portal. Buried in the expense section was an entry for Community Branding Consultation, $2,400. It was dated just 1 week before the mailbox ban. So that was it. Linda had hired a design consultant, probably one of her old clients, to modernize the community's color palette. The blue mailbox didn't violate harmony, it violated her vision. Second, I gathered evidence of selective enforcement. Screenshots of at least 3 other homes with minor violations, slightly mismatched trim, faded shutters, uneven fence stain. None of them had received citations. And finally, I found something extraordinary, a board agenda draft in the document archive. Line item 3 read, Proposal, Uniform Mailbox Replacement, HOA-funded pilot, starting with board member properties. Translation, they were planning to replace their own mailboxes with fancy ones at the community's expense. By Monday night, I had everything compiled in a binder thick enough to make a thud when it landed on a desk. The community center parking lot overflowed. Apparently, the board hadn't expected a full house. But word spread fast, everyone wanted to see what would happen when the so-called mailbox rebel faced the committee. Linda opened the meeting like she was hosting a courtroom drama. She lectured about maintaining visual order and honoring the heritage of Willow Creek. Then she called my name. I stood, calm and deliberate. When I reached the front, I placed my binder on the table. Inside, labeled tabs read, Evidence, Bylaws, Budget Records, and Pending Review Documentation. I started with Section 4.7b, the one they conveniently ignored, and then presented my resubmission request timestamped before the violation notice. The treasurer adjusted his glasses. The audience leaned forward. Then came the second tab, Photos of other violations ignored by the board. You could feel the energy shift. The whispering started. Finally, I flipped to the last tab, the $2,400 consultant expense and the mailbox replacement proposal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. If Linda thought this was just about a mailbox, she was about to learn what happens when the HOA's favorite narrative starts unraveling in public. She tried to regain control, stammering about context and design integrity. But it was too late. The treasurer suddenly seemed very interested in the floor tiles. Other board members looked anywhere but at me. Residents began murmuring questions, loud ones. Someone asked why their HOA dues were paying for design consultations. Another shouted about being fined for having the wrong size house numbers. The meeting slipped out of Linda's hands like sand through fingers. When she finally called for order, I simply stepped back and said I'd comply once my resubmission received proper review, as required by their own bylaws. The crowd clapped. Not wild applause, but that slow, knowing kind of clap that says we're done being afraid of you. At this point, I'd turned their fine into fuel, their rulebook into my armor. But Linda wasn't finished, she still had one move left, and it would make everything personal. The next morning, I found another envelope taped to my door. This time, it wasn't about the mailbox. It was a notice of violation, landscaping maintenance, code 6.2a. Apparently, my grass was uneven. I measured it myself, 2 inches exactly, well within the 3-inch maximum stated in the handbook. The violation was fake, pure retaliation. That's when I realized, she wanted me to break. To lose my temper. To make a mistake she could weaponize. So I didn't. I documented everything again, photos with timestamps, copies of every notice, even the weather report showing the rain delay that week. Then I filed a formal complaint, board harassment and retaliation under Section 2.9, attaching all evidence from both incidents. If they wanted to play petty, I'd play precise. And my next move would turn the HOA's obsession with order into its greatest embarrassment. By midweek, the story had spread beyond Willow Creek. A local newsletter picked it up under the headline, Resident Challenges HOA Over Color Ban. The article quoted anonymous neighbors calling it a power play gone wrong. For the first time in years, residents started showing up to meetings. Questions were asked. Receipts were demanded. Transparency became the new buzzword. I knew I was getting close to the breaking point, the moment when their system of intimidation would finally snap under its own weight. And when it did, I planned to be standing right in the center of the fallout, holding that same blue mailbox as a trophy. By the weekend, Willow Creek no longer felt like the HOA's playground, it felt like a stage. Every driveway conversation, every porch whisper, every half-closed blind hid someone waiting for the next act. And I was ready to deliver it. I started preparing my final strike. The board had their bylaws, their citations, their self-appointed authority. I had proof, patience, and the one thing they'd never expect, an audience. On Saturday morning, I rolled the blue mailbox out to my front yard like an art installation. Around it, I set up small placards, laminated printouts of actual HOA violations, each one absurd in its own right. Fence height exceeds 72 inches. Mailbox angle too steep. Grass growth uneven. People stopped to read, to laugh, to shake their heads. It looked less like rebellion and more like an exhibit, the Museum of HOA Ridiculous Rules. I didn't charge admission. I didn't say a word. I just let the spectacle breathe. But what I didn't expect was that my little protest would end up on the agenda of the next county council meeting, and that was where everything truly unraveled. On Monday morning, an email from the city's Planning and Development Office popped up in my inbox. It said, Public concern logged, HOA enforcement practices in Willow Creek. Apparently, Someone had submitted a report, anonymously, flagging the association's inconsistent code enforcement. I didn't know who sent it, but I had my suspicions. That same day, the HOA distributed a letter to every resident titled Community Standards Clarification, Exterior Aesthetic Policy. It was 4 pages of bureaucratic jargon attempting to justify every petty action they'd taken. But buried in the last paragraph was the admission I'd been waiting for: the mailbox rule had been pre-adopted pending member ratification. Translation: they'd enforced a rule that wasn't even official yet. I printed that letter and taped it directly to my mailbox, right next to the violation notice still fluttering in the wind. D.by Thursday night, the community meeting room was packed again. I didn't plan to speak this time, but Linda did. Her voice shook as she tried to restore order, claiming misinformation, online rumors, and residents undermining unity. But the audience was done listening. One by one, neighbors raised their hands with questions she couldn't answer. Why were only some violations enforced? Why were funds spent without approval? Why did fines appear before review periods ended? Each question hit like a hammer. The treasurer finally muttered something about seeking external review. Someone motioned to dissolve the current board pending election. The vote passed, nearly unanimous. Linda sat froze. But the real twist? I still hadn't revealed my final card, the one that would make this satisfying revenge story echo through every HOA gossip circle in town. The following week, the county compliance officer arrived unannounced. He carried a clipboard, a camera, and a copy of the HOA's charter. Turns out, Willow Creek had been operating on an outdated incorporation certificate, expired almost a year earlier. Any rule changes or fines issued during that lapse were legally void. Every violation. Every penalty. Every notice of non-compliance. Gone. It took weeks to process, but eventually, a letter landed in every resident's mailbox, ironically, in bright blue ink, all enforcement actions under review for procedural invalidity. I kept mine in a frame. When the dust settled, a temporary committee replaced the old board. New elections were scheduled. Transparency meetings began. The new bylaws explicitly required resident votes before any design change, and they finally added one new clause: mailbox colors shall be considered individual expression. I painted mine again, just slightly darker than before, a subtle nod to everything that had happened. Linda moved out quietly 2 months later. Her house sold for less than list price, the only home on the street without a mailbox installed. It had been removed for repairs. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. And every time I walked past that empty post, I couldn't help but smile. Not because I'd won, but because the entire neighborhood finally learned what happens when people stop being afraid of petty authority. Looking back now, I realize this was never just about color. It was about boundaries, the line between community and control. HOAs are supposed to protect neighborhoods, not police them. But when leadership turns into obsession, even something as small as a shade of blue becomes a battlefield. The mailbox still stands out among the rows of gray and black, catching the light each morning. A small rebellion-turned reminder that sometimes, the best revenge isn't destruction, it's documentation. And in Willow Creek, everyone remembers the day the rulebook fell to its own ink. Tell me your HOA horror in one line, let's see whose story tops a blue mailbox.